The Podium Pod is brought to you by The Pick and Roll. Head to pickandroll.com.au and subscribe for in-depth commentary and analysis on Aussie hoops. We're also brought to you by FBL, Fantasy Ballers League, an Australian baller lifestyle brand that aims to provide you with classics on and off the court. FBL makes a bold statement in its distinctive white, black and gold colours, with products ranging from basketball shoes to apparel, accessories and more. Be bold with gold. Check out the FBL collection at fblsport.com today. And don't miss the 2023 FIBA World Cup, with all 82 games brought to you live and exclusively across ESPN, ESPN2 and the ESPN app. Plus, all Boomers games, Team USA games and finals will be available on ESPN via KO freebies at no charge. Hello and welcome to the Podium Pod, the podcast covering the 2023 FIBA World Cup across Indonesia, Japan and the Philippines. Brought to you by the Pick and Roll. Adam Webster again with you, and I'm joined live from Okinawa once again by my broadcast partner and Clutch Radio colleague, Jacob Dool. Jacob, a really rough episode to record. It's I think I felt very similarly after the German game when we lost, and really tough to find answers for what needs to go right for this team moving forward. We'll talk about that, but overall, just a killer loss to Slovenia last night, which ended Australia's World Cup 2023 hopes and puts them well below where they expected to be.
Yeah, a really rough finish to this tournament for the Boomers. Their worst finish at a major tournament since the 2014 World Cup, which, given the talent on this roster, I think everyone can agree is disappointing. And just the way that it happened against Slovenia as well. I know we'll go into more detail, but just a rough game to watch. It was painful. It was really disappointing in real time, the way that they just couldn't get anything going and never quite found their footing. But as you say, now looking ahead, it's about trying to find some answers and how this team can improve.
We'll talk about the game first, and then we'll talk about that improvement, which has been well documented over the course of the last 24 hours. Olga Norlich wrote an article about that at ESPN. Matt Logue had some more coverage, and you did as well through the Pick and Roll. So check out all of our friends' articles, including your own. But the major call out from the game, where it looked like it was out of Australia's reach, was across the second and third quarters, where Luka Doncic fell into foul trouble, got his third foul in the second quarter, got his fourth foul in the third quarter. There were periods of 5 to 7 minutes where he was not on the floor. And you look at those two quarters in isolation, Australia won the third quarter 22-21 and the third quarter 22-17. They just couldn't eat into enough of that 10-point lead. Without Luka on the floor for the equivalent of an entire quarter of this game, you needed to take the lead in those circumstances and put greater pressure on Slovenia to not only bring Luka Doncic back on earlier in foul trouble, but also capitalize on not having one of the best players in the world out on the floor. And the Australians just could not do that at all.
And you have to wonder whether maybe Australia's game plan was a little too focused on Luka Doncic. And I know it feels harsh to say that, because that should be the focus. He should be the one that you're trying to stop from beating you, get the ball out of his hands. But the Boomers just didn't have anything to go to when he was off the floor. Brian Goorjian said post-game that their plan was to get the ball out of Doncic's hands, and he was actually really happy with the way they did that. But then Slovenia's other players were the ones to beat Australia, and when Doncic was forced off with that foul trouble, they kept on beating the Boomers. They didn't slow down without him on the court, because, for large parts of the game, he wasn't involved anyway, because the Boomers were hedging so hard onto him. So it was just it's a near impossible tightrope to walk, keeping Doncic quiet while respecting his teammates. And it just feels like the Boomers didn't quite tread that line right last night.
Well, Luka was still brilliant. He ended up with 19 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists. He had 6 turnovers, so they were able to blitz him and force a really bad pass on quite a few occasions from Doncic. But the other players in Slovenia stepped up. Mike Toby was great. He had 18 points, 12 boards, 5 assists. He was, the open man pretty constantly. And not only did he finish at the rim and outside, but he also found open teammates with those 5 assists. So it was discussed on commentary from Trevor Gleeson that Australia was doing a good job of blitzing Doncic, but they were letting the roll man get the ball, and then he was just having his pick of whoever in the corner or on the wing that he wanted to get, and it just resulted in bad situations time and time again for Australia defensively, which, as you say, very Luka-centric game plan, but you have to sort of ask yourself, okay, now you've got the ball out of Luka's hands, then what? Because it appears like there wasn't much thought put into then what.
Yeah, and I think it was Olgun Uluc that pointed out in his article on ESPN that the Boomers, as a result of those really hard double teams every time Luka got the ball, were essentially playing 5-on-4, or sorry, 4-on-3, I guess, against the rest of Slovenia's team. And that's just the numbers obviously don't add up. That's not a sustainable way to play. And when you've got someone like Mark Toby, who first of all is this massive target, as the roll man under the basket, they can get the ball to him anyway against this Australian team that couldn't match his size, let alone when the defense is scrambling and he so often ends up with a small switched onto him without really even doing anything, as the rotations are flying. So as you say, he was able to exploit those mismatches both himself and finding others, and that's not really a surprise. He's a really good player. So as you say, was there enough thought put into the next steps after getting the ball out of Doncic's hands? How do you stop a Mike Toby? How do you stop a Prepelic? How do you stop these other players who are all really talented in their own rights, but maybe fly under the radar a little bit?
And offensively, we have to talk about Josh Giddey's explosion in the third quarter. He got this team back in the game, but very quickly they surrendered that opportunity and found themselves in a hole once again. He was 25 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, a couple of steals in there as well. Paddy Mills fought bravely as he's done throughout the 4 games that Australia's played so far, 17 points, 8 boards, 3 assists. Dante Exum had a couple of moments there, here and there. He had 13 points, had some nice drives to the rim, hit a 3-pointer as well, but there just weren't enough contributors on this team offensively. 8 of 24 from 3. You've got guys like Nick Cage, Yorp Reith, Xavier Cooks, who was absolutely brilliant in the previous game against Japan. Joe Ingles, all of these guys had, had 3 or less field goals attempted. So you weren't getting these guys shots. They weren't able to get quality shots off. So, they forced themselves into situations where Dante was 4 of 13, Paddy was 5 of 13. They didn't have enough contributors. They didn't have enough weapons on offense. And we also have to talk about the outside shot as well. We spoke about it before we recorded, but Slovenia did an amazing job of just getting into the paint and packing the paint and stopping Australia from getting any dribble penetration. So when Australia kicked it out, you didn't see them show the confidence and the ability to hit the shot from outside. And there were even some players that you highlighted were maybe a little bit timid from behind the line as well and did not want to shoot threes.
I think everything kind of comes back to the fact that this Australian group, as it is currently constructed, doesn't really have any half court offense. They don't seem to be able to create in the half court when things slow down because, a lot of those issues came from just no movement of players or the ball. Xavier Cook said himself after the Japan game, he feeds off of the playmakers on the court with him. He's not going to go out and create his own shot. Joe Ingles isn't going to create his own shot. The guys who are Dante Exum, Paddy Mills, and Josh Giddey, and they just had to do it too often. They were stuck pounding the ball at the top of the 3-point line and then having to drive into that packed defense and force something up. And it's just not a sustainable way to play. And the only time that the Boomers really looked good offensively, for a brief stint against Finland and maybe a half against Japan, was when they could push the tempo and get out and run. And that was just something that Slovenia weren't going to let them do. They hustled back really hard, and when they couldn't get back and defend in time, they fouled. They fouled Paddy Mills as he crossed half court half a dozen times at least, I think. And they did it so they didn't get called for an unsportsmanlike, but they did it to stop the play and force the Boomers to play in the half court. So just every aspect of this game was played at Slovenia's pace. And that was the one thing that Gorgian highlighted before the game. He kept saying it's about the pace, it's about the tempo. And when the tempo is not there and when it's not upbeat, the Boomers really don't have anything to generate consistent points outside of the glimpses that we saw from Josh Giddey, who was fantastic.
And you have to question
as the only real source of offense.
You have to question the choice to play that up tempo style and not have the ability to change the pace down to a slower, more half court style, because teams at this level in FIBA basketball are too good at stopping you from running like that and have, the ability to be able to dictate the pace of the game. So you just saw, as you rightly pointed out, a real problem with Australia's half court offense throughout this World Cup, and it was exploited by Slovenia extremely well. And there need to be reviews, changes made, etc., ahead of Paris in 12 months' time, because we've qualified for Paris 2024. That's probably the big positive to come out of this tournament, that we don't need to worry about any further Olympic qualifiers or not making that tournament. Our attention turns to Paris, and our attention has to turn to the squad that goes to Paris. I read someone mention today that the walk-up starters for that series are, Josh Giddey, Paddy Mills, Josh Green, and maybe Xavier Cooks, or maybe Dyson Daniels, maybe Dante Exum. But there's a lot of spots to fill, and there's a lot of spots that will need a hell of a lot of fight from a lot of players around Australia and playing around the world to try and get to Paris. We've seen articles about Ben Simmons this week. We've obviously got Tyrese Proctor, who is likely to be drafted in the lottery next year if he has a great season at Duke. You never know where he could be and whether he could be brought in as a really young player into Paris. So, Jacob, what say you? What do you think about the team that went to Okinawa this year, and how different, potentially drastically different, that team could be in Paris?
I think there's definitely some scope for change in this team, and Gorgon said himself immediately post game that there will be tough decisions to be made. The one thing I will say about both this team here and the one that will go to Paris is that Jock Landale is the other lock to go to the Olympics, and I think he and this team would have made a big difference
Yeah.
helping those issues that we've talked about. In the half court, he was going to be the pick and roll partner for Gideon Mills. He was going to be the dump option in the post, where if nothing else is happening, you drop it into him and maybe he can make something happen. So I think it's hard to overstate how big a loss he was leading in. The Boomers were upbeat about it and were confident in the talent that they had, but it was the player they could least afford to lose. And it showed at this tournament that they were missing him. But outside of adding him back in there could still be a lot of change ahead of Paris. Whether some of the old guard are forced to assess whether they are still in these Boomers squads at the big tournaments, whether some of those new players you mentioned are going to be ready in time to take their place. There's just a lot of moving parts at the moment, and it is a real transitional period, it feels like, for this Boomers program. So it could go any number of ways, and whether this team will be ready in Paris to compete for a medal as everyone expected them to here is going to be something interesting to watch.
Such an interesting next 12 months in the landscape of Australian basketball from a Boomers perspective. We're about to enter what should be a fantastic NBL season. You and I will be on hand, obviously, for Tasmania Jack Jumpers games via Clutch Radio, but you have the opportunity for players like Will McDowell-White to announce themselves, and Keanu Pinder to announce themselves as, pick me, take me to Paris. I have the talent. You've got DJ having a 10-day contract with Washington as well as a shooter. And I want to ask, lastly, before we move on from Australia, about Chris Goulding. He barely played in this tournament, and one of the things that Brian Goorjian said pre-tournament was that he singled out Goulding's ability to stretch the floor with Giddey on the floor to give him space to operate and space to orchestrate. It's kind of glaring that Goulding didn't play. He played 1 minute yesterday in junk time against Slovenia, and barely saw court time across the entire tournament, which is a real surprise.
It is, and last night's game just seemed like the exact scenario that you have Chris Goulding there for. No one can buy a bucket, no one can hit anything from beyond the arc. Everything's just getting congested in the paint. I would have thought that's where you throw Chris Goulding out there, even just for a few minutes when the game's still up for grabs, and tell him, just let it fly, have a go, see what happens, because no one else is making anything. So it was strange that he didn't get any run in the early games, but even stranger that he didn't last night, because it just seemed like there was nothing to lose there at certain points by putting him out there. And as you say, with Josh Giddey, you know, trying to get to the rim and make things happen, just that bit of extra spacing, I don't see how it could hurt. So it was an interesting decision for sure, and one that I'll be interested to hear some justification behind in the coming days, hopefully.
Well, Slovenia and Germany will be the two teams to advance from Group K in this tournament. They're currently 4-0 in play and will play tomorrow evening. Australia will play Georgia in its final Group K game, which will be for third spot in Group K. We'll go around the other groups as well because we're about to enter the bracket period of this tournament, and there's some really interesting battles occurring and some really interesting results that we want to talk about. Firstly, Canada and Spain had run the table on their groups and then proceeded to lose their first second round game. Spain to Latvia, Canada to Brazil. So now all four of those teams find themselves at 3-1 heading into the last game of the second round. Now, in that group, you have Spain versus Canada and Brazil versus Latvia. So we are now faced with one of Canada or Spain will not play further in this tournament, which is absolutely huge. One of Brazil or Latvia will finish with 4 wins. One of Canada or Spain will finish with 4 wins. Those two teams will follow through to the bracket phase of this tournament, Jacob. And to think that Spain and Canada had the opportunity to bow out of this tournament even 3 or 4 days ago was ridiculous. Canada looked like the best team in this whole thing. Spain were just motoring along as they do. But now one of those teams will be eliminated tomorrow.
It's bizarre, isn't it? And we've seen surprises already in this World Cup. France going out in the first round. Australia now going out before the quarterfinals. But this feels almost as big as that France upset, because Canada came into this tournament just firing on all cylinders, scoring a massive amount of points every game, and then they get held to 65 points by Brazil, and suddenly they're on the chopping block. And Spain, similarly, maybe not as talented on paper and not as highly regarded coming in, but they're just one of those teams that you expect to see at the quarterfinals every tournament. You can just pencil them into the bracket before things even start. In permanent market, you don't have to worry about them. But that game between Canada and Spain is now, essentially an early start to the knockout phase of this tournament, and it's going to be a really high level game. And one team is going to come away from this tournament feeling incredibly disappointed to have gone out so early. So that's one of the first must-watch games, I think, of this World Cup, and it's come maybe a bit earlier than we expected.
And huge respect to Brazil and Latvia for their tournaments as well. Brazil obviously beating Australia in those warm-up games. We thought that wasn't necessarily indicative of Brazil's ability to get deep into the tournament. We were wrong. They've been great. Latvia obviously knocked off France, and they have the opportunity to beat Brazil tomorrow and advance to the quarters as well. So great stories for both of those teams toiling away and being able to make noise. The other group that has some knockout games tomorrow is Group I. Serbia will play the Dominican Republic for a spot in the knockout phase. Italy will play Puerto Rico for the other knockout spot in that group. So a really interesting one for both of those sides. Italy obviously suffering a bit of a loss in the group phases, which put them back a little, but they have the opportunity now to advance. Serbia and the Dominican Republic, probably the two favourites to advance from this group, but just like with Canada and Spain, one of those teams will miss out after tomorrow's game. So some really exciting potentials there, and Serbia have a plus minus at the moment of 89. So to see them bow out was unthinkable, I think, previously. So if the Dominican Republic can knock them off and knock them out of the tournament, that will be a huge upset.
Yeah, we've probably undersold Italy's win over Serbia, haven't we? That's almost in that same tier as the
Yeah.
Canada and Spain results in terms of an upset, because Serbia were really motoring early in this tournament. Bogdan Bogdanovic, Nikola Jovic playing some really good basketball, making a lot of shots, and an Italian team that has kind of flown under the radar a little bit, I think, just punched them in the mouth, and Simone Fontecchio just got going and scored 30 points, and suddenly
Been on
Serbia are on the
fire.
brink of being eliminated too. So this tournament is throwing up a lot of potential boilovers. And when, especially for these European teams, there's some really hot competition for qualifying spots at the Olympics. It's high stakes basketball. So to have so many must win games so early with so much on the line is exciting, and you hope that a few more upsets can happen, because if Australia is not going to be in the tournament, then we love to see an underdog doing well.
Well, I was going to say, just because Australia has bowed out of the race for the Naismith Trophy does not mean the Podium Pod is ceasing to be. We'll continue to bring you coverage across the rest of the 2023 FIBA World Cup. We have Ben Malice, that is currently in Manila, ready to take in the bracket phase. Jacob may indeed join him as well. And we also thank Tom Hirsch as he continues his, or starts his family holiday in Tokyo, for his contributions to the Podium Pod, and look to have him on before we're all said and done too. Jacob, all the best for your last few days in Okinawa, and look forward to hopefully seeing you in Manila.
Thank you. And yeah, hoping to see the Boomers pick up one last win against Georgia, and then onto the knockout stage, and hopefully plenty of good basketball there.
That was the Podium Pod, the podcast covering the 2023 FIBA World Cup, presented by the Pick and Roll. Thanks very much for listening, and see you again next time.